Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by David Beckmeyer, one of my fellow Democracy Group podcasters. He's the host of the most excellent Outrage Overload podcast, and today we'll be talking about, well, outrage, of course, but also what many people misunderstand about the other side and also the political system, who profits from the outrage industry, why outrage is so common in modern politics, and what we can do about it. David, it's great to have this opportunity to talk with you.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks so much for making time for this, Michael.
So I thought that because this is a crossover episode between the Politics Guys and Outrage Overload, that would make sense to start with just kind of a quick intro about our respective shows to give listeners sort of a sense of who we are and what we do. Do you want to kick us off with that?
Sure. I mean, I think, it's going to be funny because my listeners will be tired of hearing about this.
Mine too, I'm sure.
They'll definitely be interested in what you have to say. But yeah, so my really brief backstory is I was in Silicon Valley for quite a long time as a developer, and then worked my way up through management and into C-level executive positions, and ultimately into in Silicon Valley investing and all that sort of stuff. And then I retired from that space and found myself sort of living in the world we all live in right now, which is kind of toxic and hostile and a lot of stuff going on. And, I found myself being like everyone else, kind of frustrated by it all. And the word that came to me about it, being sort of a layman and not really knowing the insider jargon, was outrage. Like that seemed to be sort of the emotion and the feeling. A lot of it was like we're kind of getting mad all the time, and there's always something else to be outraged about. So that's where I wanted to sort of start. And then I'm kind of a science geek, so I said, well, there must be some folks doing research about this in the scientific world. So, and of course there was. So then that's kind of where it started. So I that's kind of the basic idea of the show is being a translation. So I'm more of a layman, a scientific geek, but not necessarily an academic. And then so I go out and try to find these research papers that relate to these fields of sort of toxic polarization, misinformation, disinformation, and then go actually let people hear from the actual scientists themselves, right? So then I'll try to just bring that out in a way that is more approachable to the rest of us, and have some fun with that as well. And then the second category, as I got into this, I discovered there's this whole world of bridge building and sometimes called depolarization work that I didn't really even know about when I was first learning about this. And well, I didn't know about it. Probably a lot of other people don't know about it. So I also bring on these practitioners and just expose that there's so many people doing work in this space and understanding it's a problem and trying to make it better. And then the third sort of lane we go in is we kind of mash up my tech background into all that, right? So I'll look at both the sort of toxic parts of social media and algorithms and AI and all that, but we also try to bring to light, again, some areas, sort of the tech for good segment that a lot of people may not know about as well. There's a lot of people working on ways to use this technology or how it might be able to restructure it to serve society better than it does now. So that's kind of what our show's about, Outrage Overload, where we basically try to lower the temperature. A lot of people think Outrage Overload means we're one of those shows raising the temperature, but our goal is to actually lower the temperature.
Plenty of shows that do that, and it's a good thing that I think you're fighting the good fight on that. And so about the politics, well, I should say, I'm a political scientist, and I've spent, I guess, it's going to sound old, but roughly the last quarter century or so, thinking, talking, researching, reading about American politics, public policy, law, media, that sort of thing. And I started out actually on the right. Ronald Reagan was kind of a hero of mine when I was a young kid. And then I moved to the left. And now I'm sort of a man without a party, I suppose. And I founded the Politics Guys in 2015 because it felt to me like we needed more spaces for intelligent, well-intentioned people who see politics in the world differently to kind of talk with each other and for folks listening to get exposed to that sort of thing, what real conversations between people who see the world differently can be like if they're done right. And that's what we try to do. And so we have a weekend show where we discuss the top political news of the week. Then we have a midweek show that comes out every Tuesday morning, which is kind of for deeper dives, various series. We did one on the Constitution, the Federalist Papers. Now we're doing series on ideologies and the new rules of politics. And we also do interviews most weeks, which drop up on Wednesday. So plenty of stuff. We both keep very busy. That's for sure. So with that out of the way, I thought we could get into maybe the sort of things that people often misunderstand. Now, you've had a lot of folks on Outrage Overload who study how they see the other side. And when people are asked to describe their political opponents, the enemy, I suppose, as we often see them now, or so many do, how accurate are they? And what surprised you the most when you really dug into the research and talked to folks about this?
Yeah, we definitely, have this misperception about the other side. One of my first guests was Peter Ditto, and I asked him this question, like, well, do we see them as, more extreme than they really are? Do we see them as disliking us more than they really are? And I just had this whole list of things, and his answer was yes. Yes, we see all of those. We do all of those things, and so yeah, there's definitely that's a truth about it. I mean, we have to admit that there are differences. It's not like a kumbaya thing. We'll all come together and everything will be great. But, we definitely misperceive many things, but particularly in the sort of animosity the other side might have for us. That's one of the big ones. And we're off by quite a bit. And, it's ironically, it's sort of the more you pay attention to politics, the more that's true. So, yeah. And I think for me, the biggest surprise of all of it, and we'll probably talk more about this as we go, is just how hard it is to recognize it when you're sort of being a party to it.
Yeah. And I think one thing that surprises a lot of folks is that there's this assumption that more information can fix this sort of thing. I mean, but what I used to tell students is there's a difference between ignorance and irrationality. And ignorance, you can help out with more information, but irrational views they oftentimes can actually be hardened, because it seems to me that so much of the information diet that people who are very active in politics get is very much a one-sided sort of really plays into their confirmation bias. At least that's my take. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, confirmation bias is one you hear a lot. There's also, motivated reasoning comes into this a lot too. And again, Peter Ditto talks about sort of moral motivated reasoning, which is even sort of more powerful. And so when our politics are involved, and particularly when we start, seeing our side as sort of the righteous side, then we apply that filter to the information that we're taking in, and we don't even always realize we're doing that. And so again, it's kind of a challenge because we think we're more informed, but we've really done a lot of filtering on that information. And we run it through this lens of, how, and you could go as far as saying, like, how dangerous is this information for my side or my identity even, rather than how true is it, right? And we don't really know we're doing that, but that's a big filter that we're using there, or a way that we're looking at information. So if it's threatening to our side, we'll tend to do a lot of rationalization to sort of explain why it's not accurate or something, or there's something not quite right about it, and it creates this feedback loop where we take the information in and we filter it through that lens. That gives us even a stronger sentiment of that, oh, we're right, we're on the righteous side, because we keep doing that selective perception of it, and it just kind of becomes a negative cycle where that the wall we're sort of putting up to protect our identity and our view of how we want the world to be becomes just more and more powerful.
Yeah, and it seems to me that it's just cognitively a lot more work to try to question your views, and you'll stop and listen to someone and try to say, well, wait a second, this doesn't conform with my view. And instead of just saying, well, you're wrong and here's why, let me stop, pull back, think about my view and how I could be wrong. There's just a lot more steps. I mean, putting aside the important factors of identity and threat and that sort of thing, just in terms of processing, you have to do an awful lot more to question your own views than to just kind of start there and you'll go on.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I really love that about, like, the way that your show models, this, because a lot of the modeling we have, what people think is like a political debate, are these kind of takedown styles, right? Yes. Where one side, I won because look what I did to the other side. And at the end of that, has that ever convinced anyone to change their view? And when you just took them down and basically humiliated them, that's not going to get you anywhere. So I love that. I love what you're, excuse me. I love what you're modeling with your show in that, because it's so much It's just something we just don't see. But yeah, you're absolutely right that it's destabilizing to have those conversations, right? Because if I'm usually in my bubble and everybody kind of agrees with me and I say this thing and everyone cheers and says, yeah, you're so right. But then I go to another bubble or a different information environment. And I go and I say the thing and everyone goes, what? That seems crazy, right? And now it's really destabilizing. And now I've got to figure out where now these people must be crazy because all my friends tell me I've got it right and everything. And so, yeah, it's a whole new world to do that. I'm a moderator for a group called Crossing Party Lines where we hold these conversations. And a big piece of what we do there is it's an ongoing thing. Like, you don't go to one workshop and now you know how to do this, right? These are muscles you have to build to get used to active listening, to staying in the conversation when it gets uncomfortable and all that. So you have to kind of practice it because it's not exactly natural.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point because it really is, like anything else, a skill, and you just can't have it right off. You really have to practice it a lot. And it was difficult for me, if I've been doing this for quite a while now, and thankfully I got a little bit better, but that's, thousands of hours of practice. And it seems to me most people who are involved in what they would call political debate, it's really more like sort of a cage match. Well, I'm interested in winning, not necessarily the truth or, what would be better but no, I want to come out of this ahead. You should be humbled. And to me, if you go into a political conversation with that point of view, okay, I'm right, you're wrong, and I'll tell you why. Well, I got to wonder what the point is.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think we talk a lot about misunderstanding other people, their viewpoints and their motives, and that's huge for sure. But it also seems to me that there's another kind of misunderstanding we maybe talk about a little bit less, and that's misunderstanding the system itself. Things like expecting that a president can essentially be the CEO of the country and act accordingly, or not understanding that just because you have a majority in the Senate doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you want, because or even more than that, just the whole constitutionally designed system of checks and balances and why that's actually a good thing. And we don't talk about that as much as those other kinds of understandings, but it seems to me that those are also incredibly important. And I'm wondering, what do you think is kind of driving this lack of understanding, and why don't we hear more about it?
Yeah, I mean, I love this question because a lot of people think there's sort of a magic silver bullet to all these things, right? And we'll just fix them all. But these are challenging problems. I mean, one is clearly you can speak about sort of a weak civics education. And there's probably a lot of room for improvement there. But, that's not everything. There's more to it than that. I think our media environment, we're fragmented, as we talked about. We kind of go in our own silos. That, helps us. In those silos, we're not going to get a civics lesson, right? We're going to get, someone's holding up a sign saying, I want this thing to happen. Like, okay, that's great. You're holding up the sign. How does that actually happen? Do you understand what's involved in making that happen? And they typically don't. And then in reality, also, our political system is kind of complicated and non-intuitive, right? and so there's a little bit of a heavy lift to really understand all this stuff. And then even getting back to the why was it built that way? That seems weird, right? And then, so I think all of those things play in. And a big piece in our modern media environment is short attention spans and all that. Again, nobody wants a civics lesson. They'd much rather be told, here's a thing to get mad about, right? So, go ahead.
It always was striking to me because part of sort of a yearly or semester-long or ritual was during one exam, I would almost always ask the standard essay question, explain how a bill becomes a law? And these were college students, so already, higher than average education, that sort of thing. And they'd heard me talk about it in class. Presumably they were awake for part of it at least and had read about it. And still, I would read through these answers and say like, oh my God, if this is... And it would blow my mind. There's so much that they missed. And so it really brought home to me how difficult it is to try, like you said, when people come in and just say, well, we can just fix it. The problem is the evil folks on the other side. But it's like, people don't know. It'd be like going in and saying, well, we want to remodel this house. Well, that's a load-bearing wall. Oh, we don't need to worry about load-bearing walls. Let's just knock this sucker down and we're good to go. And I think that makes it so much harder because you're right. It's complex. It's boring stuff. But the thing is just like with housing systems, I mean, electrical, plumbing, these things are awfully important. And if you don't understand them and you just start knocking walls down, well, you're going to be in for a lot of grief. And a lot of people, I think, just don't really appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, like you say, there's the whole create how does a bill become a law piece, but then there's even more to that, because now you have a law. How does that, like, how does the law isn't self-enforcing? So how does the law sort of work in practice, and what happens now that you have a law? And all of that stuff gets complicated. And I think our American system in particular, is really built on this idea that you need coalitions to make things happen, with the sort of checks and balances idea and all these other aspects of it. It was built that way, that you would build these coalitions, because that's kind of how we started. A bunch of little independent, they weren't even states yet, a bunch of little independent colonies that didn't agree about much, and they're going to have to try to form this government somehow. And it was, they didn't even like each other, a lot of them, right? And so it was kind of based around that model. And and we've lost touch with that in a lot of ways because, social media, and we want our quick results and all that. We think, there should be able to just some place I can just do this one thing and it'll magically fix all these problems. And even the idea of, building coalitions and compromise has all become sort of bad words. Like they're all like, the word compromise means I'm sort of compromising some moral important part of my identity. And, but it's like, as long as you hold that, I did a whole episode on this in 2024, kind of leading up to the presidential election then, that I called America on the Knife's Edge, because if we both only, where basically, as an electorate, we sort of magically want the opposing views to sort of just go away. If they would just go away, everything would be great. But it's like, that's not really realistic when it's half the country, right?
But then, I wonder, I mean, there are people sort of like us in this kind of political junkie class, I suppose. But most folks actually aren't like that. And kind of for us, this smaller group politics can be like a religion. It can be an identity, that sort of thing. And so the stakes are super high. But my sense is that most Americans really just want politics to go away, essentially. And so there's this one argument that, well, there's all this outrage and people are being misled. And sometimes I wonder, well, is that actually true, or is that just true of the political junkies and the political junkies who write the news and do the media who cover them? And maybe the vast bulk of Americans have reasonable common sense and they know how things are, and they're happy to punish the party that gave them bad stuff and reward the party that gave them good stuff. And so maybe we're not thinking broadly enough in that sense. What do you think?
Well, I think it almost goes back to something we were talking about before, this whole idea that's actually a nuanced answer, right? Because, there isn't like a black and white thing that some segment of America doesn't know stuff and the elites know stuff. And
Yeah.
and that's just how it is. I mean, the reality is it's a very uneven, knowledge is spread very unevenly, right? And I think and it certainly is true that sort of this, you can use this like a sort of a weapon to say, oh, I'm the smart one. I know the things. And you regular people misunderstand politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's something we have to be careful about, because it can be that sort of self-flattering sort of thing. But there's a reality there too, right? But it is more nuanced because that information is unevenly spread. And I think you're right. I don't think there's one, if you look at sort of the more in common folks and the idea of this exhausted majority, even that, you have to be careful not to flatten that into one thing, right? I mean, that's actually, there's a lot of different sort of groups within the exhausted majority. What they have in common is they're sort of exhausted about all this political fighting, but sort of the solutions and how you get there is also can be a challenge too, because, sometimes again, it comes back to this kind of misunderstanding things that even then sometimes, the simple solutions there don't always work either. And sometimes I talk about this idea of a unity paradox where, almost universally, or certainly a vast majority of people kind of do have this sense that they're the common sense people. I mean, we can talk about that science, the psychology of that a little bit too, and they're the common sense ones, and that all these other people are causing a problem. And so I would like, we would like unity. Like that's something most Americans would say, yeah, I would like there to be more unity. But how you get to unity, my unity, how you get there and what that line is of what you're willing to tolerate or accept or coexist with even, is where this starts to become, something when when the rubber meets the road, it's a lot harder to sort of say it than really do something. A lot harder to do something about it than just say it.
Yeah, definitely. It made me think of kind of a related thing, this idea that I think we often tend to see the other side as this kind of unified monolith sort of thing, right? And the problem is that starts to break down once you start talking to actual people. And I think that's part of the problem is that most of us don't have real political conversations with folks who disagree with us that aren't scream fests or just, and so I think that we don't see that in real life, which can be really frustrating to try to advance solutions.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think part of just the modern life that we live now, it's easy to sort of be in sort of a filter, like we said, easy to be sort of in your information bubble. And, again, we don't like these destabilizing conversations, so we sort of avoid them. So even if we know somebody, we might still be friends with folks that have different views. But we often don't really talk about politics that much, or we're very careful about how we do it, which is, I get it. Like you, sometimes the relationship is more important or is the most important thing, and that's as good as it will get. But I think this idea, people talk about, never talk politics or religion. I think that's actually not great advice, right? I mean, if you have friends and people in your network that view things differently, if we could get more comfortable with having those conversations and, have some of the skills we talked about earlier where you're able to stay engaged, you're able to stay in the conversation and not turn it into these, win-lose battles, then yeah, we'd all be better off.
And, one thing I really appreciate about Outrage Overload is your commitment to lowering the temperature and explaining why that's a good thing. But I think there are some instances where, some things genuinely are outrageous. I mean, when you see massive corruption or like horrific cruelty, real abuses of power. And I think it can be really challenging to try to find a way to draw the line between justified outrage and sort of performative, well, not even performative outrage that is sort of created and foisted on us. And what do you think about how we navigate that tension, or try to at least?
Yeah, we've had Kurt Gray, who is a moral psychologist, on this several times, and he's got a whole new world that kind of about moral psychology that kind of surpasses or supersedes a lot of the John Haidt sort of work. And he has a book out that you can read about called Outrage with an exclamation point.
Of course.
And yeah, so we talk about that a lot, that, and that's one reason why. So outrage has a purpose, as you say, right? I mean, sort of historically, and even going back, like, I don't know, some people aren't super bought into the whole evolutionary psychology thing, but you could at least understand the idea of it, that outrage even, was something that was probably maybe invented early on to kind of keep norms within tribes and so on, right? So when somebody was out of line or something was happening out of line, we would get outraged about it and we would sort of bring it back to norms. And we still see that, right? I mean, something's going on, somebody's polluting your local river, and we all get kind of mad about it, and we go talk to, we write petitions and we do these things. And that can be it definitely serves that purpose, right? It serves a purpose in that way. And the reason why I talk about why that one of the show's title is Outrage Overload, because that sort of doesn't work when you're sort of always dialed up to 11, right? Yeah. There's no place to go from there. And yeah, so picking out the things that we should probably be more outraged about. There's probably a lot of stuff we should be more outraged about, but we're sort of so swamped with everyday new outrages coming at us that it's very hard to do that. And we talk about a lot. We've mentioned this idea of some things are a heavy lift several times already today. And this one's kind of a heavy lift too, right? To sort of identify, should I be this mad about this? I mean, that can be kind of hard. And, for me, some of that is just maybe do a little bit more deep dive on it, right? Like there might be more context to this thing. It looked real bad when you saw the video and they framed it this certain way and it was put in this context. And you might go learn about it and go, it wasn't that bad because really it was kind of within this larger context and it said this thing and it was kind of, if you put it in there, it may not be as outrageous. But like you say, other things maybe are more outrageous, like you say. So I think that's part of the problem. It's a little bit of a heavy lift to go sort of go beyond the headline to see if maybe the thing is not as bad as you thought it was, because we do seek out this stuff. I mean, we're probably going to talk about that a little bit, but that we want these things, right? Because it kind of helps validate our moral righteousness, right? We want to see the other side do bad things because then we can go, see, we told you they're the bad guys.
But, and there's this term outrage industry, and I kind of like it as a quick descriptor, but also, it has this sort of conspiratorial things. There are a bunch of folks meeting in some back room, how can we make them angrier and so forth. But to me, it's much more, I mean, I study political institutions and incentives. And to me, when you look at the incentive structure, it's for the most part about not so much getting people outraged, but capturing their attention. And Outrage is fantastic at doing that. And so honestly, if happiness and light led to clicks, donations, engagement, we'd see a ton of that. So I think for the most part, most of the media and most commentaries don't really care about outrage in and of itself. There are some exceptions when there are truly outrageous things, but for the most part, it's really just all about capturing attention in an increasingly fractured environment, I think. At least I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, those incentives drive certainly a huge part of it, but particularly in social media and even in traditional media, the likes and click and attention revenue model creates a lot of this. Now, I will say, that even though maybe there wasn't Mr. Burns somewhere sitting at the top coming up with this idea, particularly in social media, with social media in particular, there is a lot of research now showing that this is not great. And there are also ways they could improve it. But they won't, because it hurts their revenue. It impacts their bottom line. So, but yeah, so you're 100% right that most of it is not really like I think I had Mike Serrazio on, and he was saying I asked him about this, and he's like, well, it could be a conspiracy theory, but being someone on the inside of media, I'm going to tell you that most of it just no one knows what the heck is going on. So they're all just doing their thing independently, and it's like you were saying, kind of water flows downhill when it all has these underlying incentives to it. I would say the one place where that may be a little bit different is in the political elite landscape itself, because politicians have kind of figured out that if I can keep people riled up and mad at the other side, it makes my life easier. I can campaign on that. I don't have to really worry about my policies. I won't be held accountable to my policies as long as I get on and people hear me saying how bad the other side is. They'll sort of ignore what I do, and we sort of see this in the numbers, right? My constituents will mostly ignore what I actually do as long as I sound like I'm hostile to the other side. So I think from that end, it has become part of a strategy, just keep them all mad at each other. And again, probably water flow downhill kind of model, but they know it works, so they keep doing it. And we're the ones that can stop it.
Well, and I think even for politicians who might not want to go in that direction, so much is pushing them that way that they almost have to. Once so many people do it that way, then they almost have to opt in just as a matter of political survival. And I think there are plenty of folks in Congress, maybe not plenty, but certainly more than a few, who find this incredibly distasteful, but just say, well, this is just how politics works, and I am simply playing the game.
100%. And I think we should also note that there are folks that are trying to do better at this. You sort of have the Spencer Cox as sort of a model of trying to do less of this and trying to create an environment where, they ran some ads where, they had the two candidates come on and say, hey, this guy's got terrible policies, but he's a good person and he's a father and he's got kids and this kind of stuff. And they sort of did that kind of thing in these ad campaigns. And I think that's a good place to start. You also see Brad Porteous has this online site called Bridge Grades, that bridgegrades.org, I believe you can go there, and it gives legislators a to F grade on their working across the aisle. They have some various metrics, and it's all open source, so you can go look at it and figure out, and they'll even take input if you think their models are wrong to try to do this. But you can get a grade of, and what you find is, of course, the ones with A's and B's grades are the ones nobody's ever heard of for the most part, right? Yeah. It's the F's and and C's that are all the people know, right? So they do exist out there. They just aren't getting as much attention.
Yeah. To me, one of the frustrating things is there's this natural human tendency when there's a problem to want to find someone to blame, right? And but the more I think about this problem, the harder it becomes, because the economic incentives, the political incentives, everything just sort of moves us in this direction. And so then I say, well, once you start to understand why people are doing this, it's sort of hard to say, well, bad on you, when in the end you could say, well, listen, no one is force feeding any of this to us, right? I mean, we could stop. We're the ones who click, we share, what have you. And so it's a reasonable question to say, well, are we victims of the outrage industry or are we the customers and creators? And I guess to me, the answer to that is yes, both, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are certainly circumstances where you could say people are sort of being caught up as being victims in it, right? Like, it's over the top and they're being drawn in
Yeah.
and stuff like that. But yeah, we're also, I always, people always hear me talking about, we've met the enemy and it's us, right? And so it's again, it takes that discipline to sort of try to pull yourself out of it to some level and try to change the way you, even something like the bridge grades idea, right? If we were holding or even just looking at legislative performance, like how many bills did they actually put forward and this kind of stuff, rather than how many times they got on TV somewhere. If we held our legislators to that kind of thing and we started voting out these people with the F grades and we started taking action, that a lot of that's on us to change our behavior and opt out of this kind of behavior, but or this kind of what we see online, what we see from our politicians, and of course what we see on TV. But it's challenging because, like you say, it's the gravity to suck you in is pretty powerful.
Yeah. Well, I think especially with the rise of small dollar fundraising and campaigns, when you think about the sort of messages that are going to appeal to someone, it's not going to be some sort of nuanced institutional explanation
Right.
of here's my 12-point plan to do X, Y, Z. It's going to be, hey, they're coming for you and everything and everyone you love. Act now. That is going to bring people in a big way. And so that, again, is just that's largely a technological environment change that just sort of biases toward more outrage, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some of these conversations with folks in nonprofit space that isn't political, like homeless or I guess you could say homeless is political, but like, animal rescue and stuff like that, right? And it's the same thing. You're not going to, you want to get people to get motivated to do something, you're going to show the starving dog, right? Like, and you could argue that that's very outrage-driven media, right? I mean, you're definitely trying to get me outraged about the fact that somebody's letting this dog starve. And you tell those people not to do that anymore, and they're going to be like, well, that's the tool that we have. Like, that's what we're going to do. So you see the same thing in the political world for sure. Yeah. So you're right. I mean, wait, now you're making me say maybe there's no solution to this. But no, I think a lot of it is us just getting more realistic about it and understanding the consequences of letting this keep spiraling. I mean, that's what has to get out there more, that this doesn't end well. Like we know historically, this doesn't end well if you let this animosity continue to spiral like this. Like I talk about how we've been telling ourselves the other side is evil, for so long, we believe it now, right? And we know that opens up all kinds of potential bad behavior, right? We become more open to non-democratic things. We even that can even, and obviously it starts heading potentially to even violence, right? We start seeing violence as a reasonable, these people are threats to our existence, and therefore, what are we going to do but violence? It makes sense, like it's justified. And so that's, to me, I think that's why it's different than some of these other things, is we have to understand that this doesn't end well, and the consequences are so much to not seeking the peace here to some degree.
Yeah. One of the things, especially in recent years, that just bother me more and more is the tendency to dehumanizing language to our opponents, because that's what I think makes it a lot easier to do things like political violence or just really stuff that would be considered beyond the pale if it were to just a normal, decent human being. But once you can say, hey, listen, they're not just the enemy, they're even kind of somehow less human, in some ways. And so then that opens up kind of a permission structure to do the sort of things that you'd never do to decent people. And that to me is just incredibly troubling.
Right. And there was, you could argue that there's been, talking about sort of the idea of the Mr. Burns in the tower somewhere coming up with the ideas. Some of that did happen within political circles where they saw that as the answer to, building their base was to create this, actually create this sort of dehumanizing language and start using this dehumanizing language. And so, that's a definitely in there. And there's also this idea of infrahumanization, where it's not quite all the way to dehumanizing, but it's like, so it doesn't feel as bad, but it's sort of a gray area where you also creates opportunity for you to feel like some of these countermeasures now are justified. Yeah. And that's exactly. So that's a big part of it is and that's, again, it's part of that moral validation, right? If we kind of want to see them that way because it makes us feel better about the moral choices we've made. We're on the righteous path. They're the bad ones. And so, we are open to this idea of this dehumanizing language and this idea that they're less than human. And again, it goes back to something else you said, that we paint everybody with this broad brush, right? Like all, we're really good at finding these caricatures that are pretty extreme. And they fit kind of all the patterns of this idea that you have, because there are people that are like that, like they're out there, and then we just kind of say everybody in that camp is like that, right? And we just kind of paint everybody with that broad brush, and so that's something that we're really good at too. And that's, as we were saying earlier, all the data shows that's definitely not how it is. I mean, we're much more complex than that.
Well, it's interesting. We find villains everywhere, but when you ask almost, I'd say, well over 99% of people, it's, are you the villain in this story? No, of course not.
No.
I'm the hero. We know that. But, we can't all be the heroes. Someone's got to be the heavy, and that means, it could be you. But anyway, so I think what a lot of folks especially on the left, would say is, listen, if you want to understand outrage and the media outrage system, you got to look at the right. With the Gingrich revolution, essentially trying to destroy trust in Congress to break the Democratic stranglehold on it, which they'd had for generations before that, literally. And then you see Fox News and a bunch of other outlets that honestly make Fox look like, almost left wing sometimes. And so I think a lot of folks on the left to say, listen, this outrage is kind of asymmetric. And so I don't want to lower the temperature, because if we lower the temperature, that's essentially disarming and ceding that ground, that very effective ground, to the right. Now, the right would say the exact same thing about the left. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm really, really glad you brought this up, because, this is a debate or a conversation that goes on a lot kind of in this whole bridge building movement. Like, are we part of the problem kind of thing, like in some way, right? But, I'll point to Daniel G. Young has a book called Irony and Outrage that I can, that might be a good thing to take a look at. But and I'll be using some of that to answer this question. But so there's truth to that, right? So there's some truth to that, right? But it's a lot more symmetric than people actually think, right? Because while the left doesn't have a Rush Limbaugh type. I mean, when they try to do that, and a Sean Hannity or whatever, when they've tried it, it hasn't worked. It doesn't land with the left. And there's a bunch of science about sort of the reasons why these different traits, these different psychological traits and ways of cognition about why that is. But then the right would also say the left controls the vast majority of popular media. And within that, there's plenty of outrage targeting in the style that the left appreciates, right? And that's comedy and satire and sort of the cerebral kind of Rachel Maddow style stuff that seems like it doesn't sound like Rush Limbaugh. They're not yelling, but they're achieving some of the same things. So there's an asymmetry in style for sure, but that doesn't necessarily reflect asymmetry in sort of function or ultimate goals, right? So both of that both of it is sort of an outrage delivery system that's just tuned for the audience they're trying to speak to. So, the left's version feels less like outrage because it's kind of wrapped in this kind of smart humor and stuff like, and satire and things like that. But it's really achieving some of the same ends. So I think we underestimate how much outrage media there is targeted to the left, and it's very effective stuff, right? It works, and because it's not shouting, so we don't see it quite the same way. So yeah, and we could definitely talk more about some of those, underlying psychological properties if we're interested in that. But suffice to say that they're, generally, and again, we have to be really careful painting with broad brushes and all that, but generally conservatives gravitate toward, a sort of emotionally stuff that like a Rush Limbaugh will do, and people on the left tend to gravitate towards irony and satire and this kind of smirky knowledge kind of stuff.
And there's in some ways, I think you make a case that might actually be less productive, because it's not just saying that kind of snarky, sarcastic sort of thing. It's not just saying you're wrong. It's saying you're wrong and also you're stupid.
Exactly.
And, obviously that's a big critique of the left, at least especially the progressive left, among a lot of folks on the right. And I think there's really something there. I mean, the manner in which you express outrage can make a real difference. And if it's just, well, this is wrong, well, that's one thing, but this is wrong and you are an evil moron, that's a whole other level. And to me, that's a big problem with some. And I enjoy some of this stuff, but I understand how toxic it can be in too great quantities.
Well, exactly. They're both achieving kind of the same idea because, I mean, Rush Limbaugh style stuff does the same thing. I mean, he just sort of tells you they're stupid, right? He doesn't sort of sneak it in and snark. He just comes out and says it. So they both kind of achieve the same thing. Like, we're the smart ones surrounded by dangerous idiots, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. But, I wonder, too, the extent to which people use outrage as sort of a signaling device to say, hey, I am serious about politics. Because if you're not, how does it go? If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention, right? I think, or something along those lines. And I think that's a problem because I think you can be deeply engaged without having outrage be your default reaction to everything. But I think for a lot of folks, they can't make that separation. No, this is, if I'm serious about politics, I am mad all the time.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult. And if you think about what people were mad about 15 years ago, and they were probably just as mad all the time, right? But now you're saying, well, these new things are way worse, but I'm still about the same amount of mad. Yeah. It's like, so clearly this has sort of been a problem, just keeping that level at the max all the time. Yeah. But yeah, there's definitely an aspect of it that there's this sort of signaling level for sure. Like it's troop. It's like tribal nature, right? I'm going to show them a good member of the tribe, and being outraged, being adequately outraged too, like sufficiently outraged, right? Is a big factor in that. And that kind of stuff is another area where we need to find a way to kind of get past some of that, because we just get so embedded in these sort of tribal. And I find I have to be careful here, because sometimes I use the word tribe and I'm kind of using it in a more academic way, like not, So it's almost more like, just think of it as groupiness, like we have this groupy nature to us. It's very strong in humans, and we create all kind of groups in our lives. Like there's, all kinds of things. It's not always just politics, it's our sports team sometime, and it's a bunch of other stuff. But the politics one is one of the more dangerous ones, right? When we start grouping around that, that's when we take on all these practices that make us a member in good standing of our group, and it's very the psychology. There's a social psychologist, I'm forgetting the name now, that talks about how being left out of your tribe is more frightening to us than actually a real physical threat. Yeah. So these tribal threats are bigger in our brain than a real physical threat. And because it feels like a death sentence to be kicked out of your tribe. And so this is powerful stuff. It's very hard to even recognize in ourselves, and it's very hard to overcome. But that's exactly why we see that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And social media obviously is a huge part of this, but of course, it's important to point out that American politics has been full of outrage from the beginning. I think back to, not that I was around for it, but the 1800 presidential election. I mean, the Jefferson camp says Adams, he has this hideous hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. And Adams shoots back and says, Jefferson's a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father. I mean, like, whoa, there's a lot of this stuff. I mean, going way back to the beginning, these revered right framers, but man, that's some gutter politics. And so I think folks might wonder, what's genuinely new about what we're seeing today compared to, the presidential campaign of 1800? What do you think the significant differences are here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I mean, you can go back even farther than that, right? I mean, printing press and all the things that happened with that. But so the idea of outrage and dirty, nasty politics and all that is definitely not new. The idea of media, challenging media environments is not new. And there's been a whole wave of this. And there's a great book that kind of talks about a lot of this called The Outrage Machine by Tobias Rose Stockwell. And but I think if you look at some of the substantial differences, significant differences with the media environment, particularly social media that we have now, an online environment, there's of course, one is just the speed and spread of information, right? So that's one obvious one, right? Stuff gets out there way faster. And, lots of research shows that sort of misinformation spreads faster and sticks more powerfully than accurate information. So we know that's a big factor in it. And even trying to do all these in all these ways of trying to interventions to try to counteract that, it's really challenging because it's already out there by the time the intervention happens and all this kind of stuff. So it's all there's that side of it. The other piece that's a big piece here, and Jonathan Stray is a great source to sort of learn about these kinds of things, tech and social cohesion work and some of the other work that they're doing. But another big piece of it is just the ability to create this sort of false consensus idea, right? Where it's really easy to create your filter bubbles now. And again, I don't even like filter bubble. It's, an information silo type thing. It's your sort of information environment. And it's really easy to create that in a way that didn't exist before. If you look, back when these sort of rural or even suburban kind of environments, these were very heterodox environments, and you saw the people you saw locally, and that's who you connected with. And so if you had a really extreme view, somebody in that network's going to be like, dude, you're kind of off the rocker over here, right? This is like, someone's going to call you out on that. And they're also going to be very tolerant of people with these heterodox views because that's kind of what they ran into all the time. And they sort of lived with that. Like, oh yeah, I agree with you on these three things and I don't about these three things. And I just like, that's cool. Like, that's just how it is. Like, we differ on these things. And it wasn't the kind of identity and connection. And you would, like I say, that was just the environment that you were in. Yeah. That's not the way it is now because I can selectively just go build whatever network of connections I want, and I can very easily isolate in that to the point where, again, you talked before about everybody sort of thinks they're the normal one, and it's very true, right? I mean, I interviewed recently, a woman who believes a lot of what most people and most independent researchers would say is pretty far-fetched stuff, She believes that, the 2020 election is stolen. Okay, a lot of people believe that. But other things, vaccines were like a biohazard weapon that was a bioweapon, and that they put placebos in most of the vaccines. That's why people didn't die from the vaccines. And, a lot of stuff like that most people would consider pretty fringe. But she considers herself, she also at the same time embodies some of the really important aspects of like the Outrage Overload show, where she wants to hear from the other side. She wants to have conversation with people and stuff. But she has also these extreme views at the same time. And she sees herself as like a very neutral researcher, very objective observer of all this stuff. And I think I just point that out to be like an example. That's even true of like flat earthers. They see themselves as the objective observer with the facts. And when other people get the facts, they'll come around and see that the earth has always been flat and you guys are living in this fantasy world. But so the point of that is that it's really easy to build that in social media. And it can have the false consensus idea is you can build something in a Telegram group or something like that. Very extreme stuff. Like, I don't even I'm to a point now where that even the more extreme media that you mentioned before, the kind of some of the right wing, that's even too neutral for me. That's too soft for me. Yeah. So I'm now building something even more extreme on Telegram. But it has this perception that it's a very popular belief because everybody in the Telegram group is there. It's a big Telegram group. It's got millions of people in it. So millions of people see this the right way. So I'm in the majority. This is the majority view. And I create this idea of that because it looks that way. And I could not do that without social media because I could not go find those millions of people that have that really extreme view. They weren't in my neighborhood. I might have found one other one or something, right? But I wouldn't have been able to build this big image of a hugely popular idea. So I think that's a big piece of social media that we often just don't see, that it lets us create these very isolated information silos.
Yeah, I feel like maybe these days the four most dangerous words in the English language are do your own research because you mentioned, confirmation bias and it's so easy to cherry pick those sort of things where you get to the point where I feel it's even more dangerous because you say, well, no, I have data, I have information. But the thing is most people don't understand that doing your own research does not necessarily mean just haphazardly looking around the internet for stuff that agrees with you and glomming onto that. Research, like anything else, is a skill that needs to be learned and developed. This is maybe coming from a biased perspective, someone who taught research methods for a lot of years, but it actually is a fairly technical skill to understand a lot of these things. And I would always tell students the first thing you should do going into any research is to remind yourself all the time that everyone is biased, including me. And the question isn't if I'm biased or if they're biased, but to understand how. And you need to start with yourself with that. And so many people just eliminate what I see as that critically important first step is saying, what are my biases?
Yeah, and again, it's a challenge because it's very hard to detect your own biases, right? You don't see them as biases. To me, they're just like common sense. Like everybody must see it that way, and so that can be a big challenge. But yeah, it is one of the most scary things when I see folks, and I've seen the kinds of things, the way that they do quote unquote research, and when they talk about, oh, I'm going to go do more research, I'm like, oh, that scares me. I know what that really means.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the big piece of that is, I've done some academic peer review type work, so I've published some papers in academia, but that's not my main thing. But I also was a professional researcher, like I ran a research lab in the corporate world. So yeah, I mean, you've got to be able to do that steelman type arguments and things like that, right? You're always looking to especially if you've got corporate money going into it, and it's true of any research. But you don't want to go put the company, a huge investment of the company in this idea that's a dumb idea, that's a straw man idea, right? So you want to be able to say, well, what if this happens, or what if that happens, or maybe I'm wrong here. Is there other research about this that says the other thing? And that's what we're not that good at, right? If you haven't had experience doing that, we're just not good at looking for that steelman argument that would sort of disprove what we think, what our hypothesis is.
Well, I think that point you make about research in the corporate world is a really great one, because that's a setting, and there are a lot of settings where we do research and we're actually more careful about it because there are clear and direct consequences for getting it wrong. But like in the corporate world, if you screw up, well, you could lose millions, maybe even billions of dollars and your job. Big deal. But in politics, because the fact that honestly, no matter how misguided any one individual is, if there's the regular person and not say the president of the United States, it's not like they're going to make that much of a difference. So it's actually, in a sense, more rational to just have these incorrect, wild, outraged views, because the psychological comfort that they give you far outweighs any damage that one individual can do for having bad, wrong, whatever views. But of course, that scales. Then when you have a bunch of people, then that becomes more of a problem. But in a way, it's irrational, but individually, it's rational. Collectively, I think, is where it becomes a little more irrational.
Well, I'll say that it's irrational in the one regard that you actually aren't doing better mentally, right?
Yeah. Good point. Fair enough.
You're probably not sleeping well, and you're sort of mad all the time. And we know a lot of that stuff is just not good for us. Yeah.
But I think, getting into what people can do, in some way, I almost feel it's like, I love potato chips and pretzels and late night snacking, and I could stand to lose, let's say 5 to 7 pounds. I'll be charitable myself, and I know what I need to do. This is not that complex. Just don't snack after dinner. It's fairly straightforward, but yet I feel it's the same way with this sort of outrage environments we expose ourselves to. We all know what we should be doing. We shouldn't be living on our phones. We shouldn't be just automatically responding to every hot take with a hot take of our own. Yet it's advice that's straightforward, but incredibly difficult. I know you've talked to a lot of people who come to similar conclusions about what we need to do. What sort of ways, based on the folks you've talked to, I mean, are there better ways to try to go about this and not completely fail like I do with, after dinner potato chips?
Yeah. Well, it's an area that I really try to spend a lot of time in, because I feel like in many ways I'm more connected to the average person with my little show than a lot of the academics are, and a lot of the sort of even practitioners, sometimes that they almost live in their own little, everybody wants to. People have already bought into sort of the bridge building. The folks that get involved in a lot of those have already bought into it. And so that's different than the average person who often viscerally reacts to it. Like, that doesn't sound good. Like that, why would I do that? Why would I want to talk to these people that I think are, evil and have bad intentions and that kind of thing? So, and I think that's a place where figuring out how to, what I spend a lot of time trying to do is talk about it more in a selfish way, in the sense that, because a lot of people see it as, why would I help that other person if I did this, right? But, all the things that I try to talk about all the ways it's better for you, and even if you want to be an advocate and you want to try to get that person to change their views and want to persuade them, you're not going to do that very well if you don't even understand their fears and their concerns and this kind of thing, right? So there's that aspect of it that for the most successful advocates understand their adversaries, and understand their fears and concerns. And so that's one aspect of it. But then there's, all of the mental health side of it that I try to make it a little bit more of a, you're helping yourself more than you don't think of it as you're helping somebody, you're being charitable to someone else. You're doing this for yourself. But it can still be hard because people do really resist it because, as you've been having these conversations for a long time. It can be challenging and it's hard and it's mentally it's a cognitive load to do it, and why would I do that when I could just still see them as bad and have another bag of chips?
I mean, what I found is that for me, the most effective thing is to seek out people who I disagree with, but not start talking about politics. I mean, I'll also talk to them in a real way, not exchanging tweets or social media comments, but just finding someone who I disagree with, who I know has views that I find distasteful, and starting to talk with them about, I don't know, like our dogs or kids or stuff, building that common ground. And if you start from that basis, as opposed to, why are you such a moron who supports X?
Right.
All of a sudden, then you start to feel a little more charitable. You're like, well, okay, Bob feels that way, but I can sort of see why he's wrong about that. And I feel like we don't do nearly enough of that because, again, that also requires a lot more effort than just simply responding to someone's tweet or post or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. If we can build a relationship around an understanding around somebody's other identities, maybe it's sports, maybe it's video gaming or something else. Yeah, you can then separate that person a little bit from that political identity side and see them as human in those other realms. And then that might help you see them as human in the political side as well, for sure. And like you say, it is some more work. But even having those kind of conversations, people sort of see that as kind of trite, like, oh, that seems too easy. Almost like what you were saying before. It seems too easy. It must not be that easy, but and it's not easy, of course. I mean, even doing that is hard. But a lot of it is easier than you think. Like you even said, put your phone down, things like that, right? Start time blocking or something, or find ways to get off the phone from when you go to bed, especially. Like it's a really bad time to be doom scrolling at bedtime. And it sounds easy, but I like my doom scrolling, but you really don't. Your body doesn't like it. But it seems trite to tell people stuff like that, or even just box breathing and some basic meditation and stuff like that. Again, it sounds trite, and people kind of get turned off to it, maybe because it seems too easy.
But I guess there's another way to look at this to say, okay, there are things that people can do, and most of us understand those things. And so then it's on us. We are the creators or the sustainers of this system. But I think a lot of other folks might say, well, listen, hold on a second. There is this system that is pushing us relentlessly in one direction. We did not create this system, we individually, it was I individually, and yet you're telling me that I have to somehow summon up this force of will 24/7, 365 to fight against this. Well, that's BS. Why don't we make some structural changes to make it easier for everyone to not engage in this constant outrage? And I really feel sympathetic to that argument, but honestly, I'm not entirely certain. I think when you press folks, well, what exactly would you have us do structurally to change things? That's a lot trickier. And I'm wondering, what do you think? Are there things, or is this just does it inevitably come down to individual initiative and effort and willpower?
Yeah, well, I think it's if we get out of this, I think it's going to be sort of coming from both directions, right? But a lot of it starts at the ground level. A lot of it starts with us, and I don't think you can have an environment where we can really seriously look at the structural stuff until we lower the temperature, kind of at the sort of individual level a little bit, right? Yeah. And so I think it kind of goes hand in hand. And I don't have the magic answer of what these structural solutions are. I'm happy there's a lot of smart people out there that are sort of looking at some of that, and I'm encouraged that I think that we'll see some things there. But sort of similar to a very earlier conversation talking about how difficult it is to get how a bill becomes a law. Any structural changes like that are really hard, and in a very divided world, where things quickly become politicized for no reason. Basically, this thing should not be politicized, but it becomes politicized. It's very difficult to make structural change because somebody sees it as a win-lose, and it can be hard, to get through. But yeah, I think it's going to have to be both. We're going to have to do some of both. I'm encouraged also by the idea that a lot of people sort of, like you talked about, you're sort of feel politically homeless. And I think there's a lot of people that feel that way. I think there's a lot of people that are sort of looking like they are sort of just have this intuitive sense that the system, quote unquote, is not working for me. So, and it's a little dangerous there because I also worry about what changes do they want? Like, where is that going? But I also think people are open to looking at, some of these structural changes, but and of course I do get concerned about that because I think a lot of things about the way the system was designed are pretty good. Like, one of the big ones you see people talk about is like, oh, well, you should get rid of the electoral college or something, right? And you're like, okay, like, what's your alternative?
Have you thought this through? Exactly all the ramifications of this, yeah.
And how does it really happen? Even if you have a great alternative to it, do you know how hard that is to, like, I think there's been like a few hundred times people have tried to do something with the electoral college and they've all stalled out somewhere along in the process. So it's, it's not, to do it's great. If you come up with a great idea for what the replacement for it should be, great. But just realize how difficult something like that is, especially in a divided world that we're in.
Yeah, and I'd say particularly because it's important to keep in mind that the people who would be the prime movers in changing these institutions and systems are largely the people who've benefited from the outrage industry and so forth. So you're basically telling them, well, do this against your interest, to benefit the greater good. That's always going to be a tough sell. But like you, I do feel at least some optimism. I mean, there are shows like yours and like mine, and we have audiences. And so I think there's a real desire for this sort of thing. And I just hope that one of the silver linings from all this is that kind of grows and we can maybe get out of constantly having to dial at 11 all the time.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, with that, I think be a good place to stop. David, it's been just great talking with you.
Yeah, it was really fun. Thanks so much, Michael. I'm really looking forward to the reaction from our audiences about this.
Definitely. Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you have a question or comment for us, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. If you're not already a supporter of the show, we hope you'll consider becoming one. Supporters get ad-free versions of everything we release, our full-length midweek episode instead of just a preview, and access to our Politics Guys Discord group. It's a fun place with a great bunch of people. You can support us on Patreon, where you can even sign up for a free trial. And if Patreon isn't your thing, or you're a current supporter and want to give us a little extra one-shot contribution, you can support us on PayPal and Venmo too. You'll find links to all our support options at politicsguys.com/support and in the show notes. If you'd like to get our full-length midweek episodes, but you're not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, just email me. I'm at mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.